Imagine sitting in a courtroom, right? The air is completely still. The judge looks down at you from the bench, shuffles a stack of papers, and says, "You broke the law, therefore blank," and your heart just stops.
Yeah, that is a terrifying moment.
Right. Because in that specific context, that single word, therefore, carries the entire weight of your future. It is a hinge that a massive consequence swings on. But what if I told you that in ancient biblical documents, confusing a judge's therefore with historians' therefore could completely alter the theology of the text?
It really changes everything.
Welcome to Reform Thinking. Today, we are opening up the linguistic blueprints of ancient Hebrew. We are looking at a specialized lexicon entry, specifically analyzing a word pronounced ʿAl-Kēn, and its base root ken. These are tiny linguistic hinges, They translate into our English Bibles as therefore, or thus, or so.
Yeah, and if you were just reading the English translation, you might gloss right over the word therefore. You'd be completely unaware that you just walked past a prophetic landmine or a massive statement about the sovereignty of God over human history.
Which is why we're doing this deep dive. Our mission today is to figure out how these tiny words structure logic, judgment, and historical causes within the ancient texts.
And, when we look at a dictionary entry for ancient adverbs and prepositions, I get it. It sounds highly academic, but these specific words carry staggering theological weight. We are analyzing authoritative texts. The placement of a single therefore dictates the meaning of a covenant promise, a divine judgment, or the explanation of a historical reality.
Right, the authors of these texts did not use filler words.
Not at all. They constructed their sentences with absolute theological precision. If we want to understand the logic of the ancient writers, we really have to look at the joints holding their sentences together.
So let's look at those joints. The primary definition provided in our source material for the word ӓl-Kēn states that it occurs 149 times in the Hebrew text. The definition given is for that reason, therefore, or so it happens that.
That is a lot of conclusions being drawn. 149 times.
It is. But the source draws an immediate critical distinction between ӓl-Kēn and another Hebrew word for therefore, which is laken. The text notes, and it cites other scholars here, that laken frequently carries a threat of punishment.
Yeah, that is a huge distinction.
Right. One word for therefore is fairly standard, while the other carries a built-in warning label. ӓl-Kēn functions entirely differently. It does not inherently carry that threat.
And the distinction becomes really clear when we apply that grid to the prophetic books versus the historical narratives. When you read the ancient text and you see laken, there is an immediate psychological shift.
You brace for impact.
Spot on. You brace for impact. You know that a prophetic oracle of judgment is likely following that word. It introduces a covenant lawsuit being handed down by God.
Wow.
But when you see ӓl-Kēn, you anticipate a logical conclusion, or perhaps a historical explanation. The text is stating, because of these prior historical events, this current reality exists. It is the language of cause and effect, rooted in history rather than future punishment.
I want to make sure the mechanics of this are clear for you listening. It's like the difference between a neutral mathematical therefore versus that judge's therefore I mentioned in the courtroom earlier.
Yeah, that's a good way to picture it.
Like, if I am doing geometry and I say, since A equals B, therefore C equals D, that is a neutral logical outcome. That feels like ӓl-Kēn. But if a judge looks down from the bench and says, you broke the law, therefore you face the penalty, that therefore has teeth, that feels like laken.
The mathematical equation versus the gavel. That is a highly accurate way to frame the distinction. It changes the posture of the reader entirely.
It really does.
You cannot simply read the word therefore and assume you know what the author is doing. You have to ask, well, which therefore is this? Is the author explaining the origin of a city, or is the author declaring the impending destruction of that city?
So to grasp the full weight of ӓl-Kēn, the lexicon notes that we must isolate its base root. And that root is simply the word ken.
Let's isolate that root.
Okay, so the lexicon categorizes the standalone word ken as an adverb meaning so or thus. The sources trace its cognates to Syriac, where the word means then, and to Arabic, where it means but. The text points out that it originates from a demonstrative root, ka.
Right, so it is a pointing word. This is not just a linguistic quirk. This root exists across ancient Arabic and Syriac as a mechanism for pointing. Imagine the ancient writer physically pointing his finger at a historical event and saying, like that.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it points back to what was just described and establishes a direct connection.
The text shows us that ken indicates quantity, quality, or degree. And the specific examples the source pulls out are incredibly vivid. It points to Exodus 10.14, which is the narrative of the locust plague in Egypt.
Right, an intense narrative.
Very. The text says, not in such numbers in Hebrew, lo haya ken arba. It literally means there was not so locusts.
And we need to look at the context of that plague to understand why the author used this specific pointing word. The plagues of Egypt were not, severe weather events. They were singular, unprecedented acts of divine sovereignty directed against the false gods of Egypt.
The ecology of Egypt was being dismantled.
Yes. By saying not in such numbers, using the word ken, the author is creating a category of one. The writer is pointing to all of previous history and then pointing to the sky black with locusts and saying, never like this. The locusts were a unique judgment.
The source also references 1 Kings 10.12, talking about the incredibly rare almug trees that Hiram's fleet brought to King Solomon. The text says, not so, Labakan. Such trees had not come in like that before. Again, it is a category of one.
And the almug trees of Solomon represented an era of unprecedented peace and wealth in Israel's history. God had fulfilled his promise to give Solomon unparalleled wisdom and riches.
Right.
So the word ken here measures the unmeasurable. It establishes the historical reality that God's blessing on Solomon was totally unique.
Okay, the lexicon zeroes in on a specific phrase next. The phrase is ken hu, which translates to so thus, or it is so. It is used to confirm that something is precisely as it has been described or commanded. Yes, a confirmation. But I have to push back a little here on how language works. How can a single tiny word juggle so many varying jobs? I mean, in one sentence, it is indicating the sheer volume of a suffocating locust swarm. In the next sentence, it is pointing to imported lumber. And in another, it is just confirming a generic statement of fact. Does that not break the consistency of the language?
Well, it would break the consistency if we treated ancient Hebrew like a rigid computer code. But ancient Hebrew is highly contextual. The meaning is entirely shaped by the surrounding environment of the sentence.
Okay, that makes sense.
The source highlights a fascinating linguistic phenomenon regarding this. Sometimes the force of the word is implied rather than explicitly stated. The word ken acts as a mirror, reflecting whatever substance is placed in front of it.
A mirror. That is a great visual.
Right. If you put a massive swarm of locusts in front of it, it reflects massive quantity. If you put a royal decree in front of it, it reflects absolute certainty.
That concept of contextual mirroring brings up the idea of reading between the lines. The source points us to a section which explicitly states that the force of ken has sometimes to be elicited from the context.
It is not handing you the meaning on a silver platter.
No, it is not. The author expects the reader to do the mental work of connecting the dots.
And the lexicon gives us a haunting example of this from Jeremiah 14.10. The Hebrew phrase translates to, so they love to wander, but the source explains what this actually means in context. It means not less than Yahweh has withdrawn from them.
We need to pause on that because the theological implications there are massive. The text literally just says, so they love to wander. But to understand how much they love to wander, you have to look at the previous verses.
Right, where God talks about withdrawing his presence and rejecting the people.
Yes. The word ken forces the reader to supply the relational weight. It requires you to meditate on the preceding verses to supply the unwritten comparison.
In Reformed theology, we understand that human beings left to their own devices will naturally wander away from God due to their fallen nature. God's grace is the only thing restraining that wandering.
Right.
So in Jeremiah 14, God is lifting that restraining grace. The people's desire to wander away into sin is directly proportional to God withdrawing his presence. The text does not write out a massive theological treatise, it just says so, and leaves you to realize the devastating symmetry of the situation.
I think of it like a musician playing a chord progression. If you are listening to a piece of music and the pianist plays a dominant seventh chord, your ear naturally anticipates the resolution to the root chord.
Yes, you can feel it coming.
The musician does not have to play the final chord for you to feel the tension pulling you toward it. That is what this word is doing in the text. The text gives you the so, but you must supply the just as in your own mind based on the theological context of the preceding verses.
And we hear that unresolved tension screaming at us in the Psalms as well. The source highlights Psalm 61.9 and Psalm 63.3. In Psalm 63, David says, "So I have looked upon you in the sanctuary."
Which sounds quite nice on its own.
Yeah, if you just read that in isolation, it sounds like a pleasant, calm, religious observation. But the word so is pointing back to his intense thirst in the wilderness in verse 1, where he says his soul thirsts for God and his flesh faints for God in a dry and weary land where there is no water.
So the translation should really be understood as, with the same desperate, agonizing thirst that a dying man has for water in a scorching desert, so I have looked upon you in the sanctuary.
Precisely. The text forces the reader to carry the physical agony of the desert into the spiritual reality of the sanctuary. It is a highly sophisticated literary device. It is demanding participation from the reader.
You have to do the work.
You do. You cannot passively read Psalm 63. You have to feel the grit of the desert sand in verse 1 to understand the gaze in the sanctuary in verse 3.
This internal contextual action naturally moves us into how this word structures external reality. We transition from internal longing to external action.
Right, moving from the inside to the outside.
The source lists frequent uses of ken in particular phrases of action. Arguably the most structurally vital phrase in the entire biblical text is found repeatedly in Genesis 1. The phrase is vayhi ken, and it was so.
Vayhi Ken is the absolute pinnacle of divine sovereignty. It is the language of fiat creation. God speaks a decree into the void, let there be light. And then we read, Vayhi Ken. And it was so.
Just like that.
Just like that. There is zero gap between the divine decree and the physical outcome. There is no resistance from the material universe. There is no delay.
God's word does not attempt to persuade reality. It dictates reality.
The structural use of this word tells us something basic about the nature of God. The word ken here is the unyielding anchor of the cosmos. The universe exists and holds together simply because he said it, and it was so.
The source also points out other phrases, like kentasu from Judges 7.16, which means, so you shall do, where Gideon is instructing his men before battle, or Genesis 29.26, where Laban tells Jacob, it is not done so in our place, lo ya'aseken.
Setting the boundaries.
Right. It is a phrase setting the boundaries of human custom and reality.
And this raises a striking contrast between divine capability and human limitation. God says, and it was so, and galaxies are formed out of nothing. But when human beings use this word, it reveals their lack of control.
How so?
Well, look at Genesis 25.22, which the source lists. Rebecca is experiencing tremendous, terrifying pain because the twins, Jacob and Esau, are struggling in her womb. And she says, if it be so, ʿAl-Kēn, why then am I this way?
God's so creates perfect order out of the void. Humanity's so is a desperate plea for an explanation in the middle of chaos and pain.
That is spot on.
Rebecca is looking at her reality, unable to control what is happening inside her own body and asking why the reality is the way it is.
Or look at the phrase ḥlo-Kēn, meaning not so. Humans frequently use this phrase to try to reject a reality they cannot control.
Do we have an example of that?
Yes, in Genesis 48, Joseph sees his father Israel crossing his hands to bless the younger son, Ephraim, instead of the older son, Manasseh. Joseph tries to physically stop his father and says, not so, my father.
He is fighting the outcome.
He is. Joseph is trying to impose his own order, his own ken onto this situation. He wants the blessing to follow standard human tradition. But the divine decree through Israel prevails. Joseph's not so is useless against God's sovereign plan for the younger brother.
Wow. There is one specific striking phrase from the text found in Job 9.35 that we have to examine. Job is in the middle of unimaginable suffering. He has lost his children, his wealth, his health. He's sitting in ashes covered in sores.
And his friends are accusing him of hidden sins.
Right. Job is trying to understand his standing before a holy God. And the Hebrew phrase is kilo ken anoki madi. The text translates it as, not so am I with myself. What an incredible expression of internal turmoil.
Job is recognizing that he does not have the internal standing or the righteousness to contend with God in a courtroom. He is saying, I am not conscious of being one who can stand upright in this trial.
He knows he would lose.
He does. The word ken here measures his own internal state against the holy standard of God. In Reformed theology, we talk about the total inability of man to stand before God's justice on his own merit. Job is staring into the mirror of God's absolute holiness, and the reflection coming back, the ken is distorted and failing.
Job finds himself totally lacking.
Yes. It shows how this simple adverb can express the deepest theological despair a human being can experience.
Job is looking at the scale of God's justice and realizing he has nothing to tip the balance in his favor. And that concept of scales and balance actually moves us into the poetry of comparison in our deep dive.
Right, the poetic scales.
The source breaks down a section dealing with agreement and similes. We are looking at the formulas ḥo-Kēn, which means as so, and kasher-Kēn, which means just as so.
The structural beauty of ancient Hebrew poetry shines here. These formulas are the actual scales upon which the biblical writers weigh heavy concepts.
Let me rapidly list some of the evocative similes from the text so you can get a feel for them. Psalm 42.2. Like the hind which pants for the water brooks, so my soul pants for you.
Beautiful.
Jeremiah 2.26. Like the shame of a thief when he is discovered, so the house of Israel is shamed.
It creates an inescapable logic.
It does. It forces the reader to apply the characteristics of the natural world directly to the spiritual reality. You understand the sudden, devastating panic of a thief being caught red-handed. Therefore, you must understand the spiritual shame of Israel's idolatry being exposed before a holy God.
It makes it so tangible.
It really does. But we should focus heavily on a phrase from Exodus 1.12 that the source provides. It is regarding the Israelites in Egypt under the brutal oppression of Pharaoh. The text says, Ka'asher yahanu otoken yerbeh. The more they afflicted him, the more he multiplied. The linguistic structure perfectly reinforces the theological point. The oppression and the blessing are placed on a perfectly balanced scale.
And the grammar actually mocks the geopolitical plans of Pharaoh. Pharaoh introduces a massive weight of affliction on one side of the scale through slavery and infanticide. He believes he is crushing the people of Israel and securing his empire.
But God has a different plan.
God uses the just as so formula to completely reverse the momentum of Pharaoh's actions. For every ounce of affliction Pharaoh applies, God applies an equal and opposite ounce of numerical multiplication to the Israelites.
That is amazing.
The sentence structure itself is a lasting proof of God's sovereign preservation of his covenant people. Pharaoh's actions are rendered entirely useless by the grammatical and theological reality of Ka'asher-Kemen.
I have an analogy for this. It reminds me of a balanced equation in chemistry.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you know that the input on the left side of the equation must equal the output on the right side. Matter is neither created nor destroyed, it is just transferred. In these poetic formulas, the emotional or historical input on the as side must equal the output on the so side.
That works perfectly.
But why did ancient writers prefer this balancing act instead of just stating the fact directly? I mean, why not just write, Israel grew a lot despite the slavery?
Because stating a mere fact does not convey inevitability. A balanced comparison creates a sense of divine order. When the text says, just as the rain falls and waters the earth, so shall my word be, it is linking the certainty of God's promise to the undeniable physical laws of nature.
You cannot stop the rain.
Right, you cannot stop the rain from falling, and therefore you cannot stop the decree of God from coming to pass. It elevates the statement from a historical observation to a theological absolute. And that logical inevitability pushes us to the concept of divine consequence.
Which brings us to the next section. We are going to look at the prepositional combinations, specifically isolating ḥalkēn from our source. The source states that this means, according to such conditions, that being so, therefore.
We are back to the judge's gavel.
Here comes a gavel.
The source stresses its frequent use in prophetic literature. It is used to introduce a divine declaration or command after stating the grounds. Therefore, thus says Yahweh, ḥalkēn ko amar Yahweh. You find this heavily concentrated in the books of Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel.
When you read the prophets, you see a terrifying pattern. God lists the covenant violations of the people. They worshipped false gods, they oppressed the poor, they ignored the Sabbath. The tension builds. And then the prophet drops the word ḥalkēn. It is the hinge upon which the entire judgment swings.
ḥalkēn functions as the final verdict in a cosmic courtroom. The prophets are acting as prosecuting attorneys on behalf of God. They present the evidence of the broken covenant. Then comes the ḥalkēn, the therefore, followed immediately by the sentence.
And it is always a direct result of the evidence.
Always. It demonstrates that God's judgments are never arbitrary. They are strictly according to such conditions. The punishment directly corresponds to the preceding list of sins. The punishment fits the crime perfectly.
The source also points out some specific conversational usages of this word, which I find fascinating because they break the courtroom mold a bit. Look at Genesis 4.15. Cain has just murdered his brother Abel. God curses Cain to be a wanderer on the earth.
And Cain is terrified.
Right. Cain objects, arguing that his punishment is too great to bear and that whoever finds him will kill him. God replies, therefore, this being so, whoever kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. It is used in conversation to reply to an objection.
Notice the mechanics of what God is doing in that dialogue. Cain introduces a new condition, his absolute terror of being murdered by others. God takes that condition, accepts the premise of Cain's fear, and issues a ḥalkēn to establish a new decree of protection.
It is a stunning display of divine accommodation in a conversation.
It is. God's therefore takes Cain's fear into account and formulates a response that ensures God's original decree of Cain being a wanderer is fulfilled, rather than Cain simply being killed by a vigilante.
The source also leads us to analyze Isaiah 26.14, where it says Lakin infers a cause from an effect or develops what is implicitly involved in a statement. The text says, therefore thou hast visited and destroyed them. The lexicon notes this is the development of what is implicit.
This is a highly nuanced logical leap. The text is not just saying A caused B. It is saying that B is the necessary organic unfolding of A.
Unpacking what is already there.
Yes, when a nation sets itself up in arrogance against God, destruction is not a punishment that gets added on later from the outside. Destruction is organically grown from the seed of their arrogance.
So the Lakin draws out the poison that was already present in the plant.
Spot on. The word operates as the gavel striking the sound block, bringing the reality of their internal sin into external physical manifestation. Sin bears its own destruction, and Lakin is the linguistic proof of that harvest.
We have seen how Lakin looks forward to a consequence or a judgment. Now we return to our main subject, ʿAl-Kēn, specifically another section of the text. The definition here is upon ground of such conditions, therefore. While Lakin looks forward to judgment, ʿAl-Kēn often looks backward to establish a permanent memorial.
This is perhaps its most vital function in the narrative texts. The lexicon explains that it assigns the origin of a name, a custom, or a proverb. It is the definitive linguistic flag for etiological statements.
And etiology is the investigation of the cause or origin of a thing.
Right. When the biblical author wants to explain why things are the way they are in his current day, he uses ӓl-Kēn.
The source lists massive core statements tied to this phrase, especially in the book of Genesis. Let me read a few. Genesis 2.24, therefore a man leaves his father and his mother and clings to his wife.
A huge one.
Genesis 10.9 regarding Nimrod, therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. Genesis 11.9 regarding the Tower of Babel, therefore its name is called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth.
Think about what is happening in those verses. The narrator is taking an ancient event, the creation of Eve, the life of Nimrod, the dispersion at Babel, and drawing a direct, unbreakable line to the reader's present reality.
Connecting the past to the present.
Yes. Why do men and women leave their parents and form a new union in marriage? The text points back to the Garden of Eden and says, ӓl-Kēn, for that reason. Upon the ground of that historical event, we have this current reality.
When you encounter ӓl-Kēn in a text, does it signal to the reader that the narrative is pausing? Is the author essentially stepping out from behind the curtain to offer a direct commentary to the present-day audience?
Absolutely. It is a breaking of the fourth wall. Moses, or whoever the ancient author is, stops telling the story of the past for a brief moment, looks directly at his audience and says, you know that tower in ruins. You know the different languages we all speak across the ancient Near East. This story I just told you, that is why.
It acts as a bridge between the ancient event being described and the contemporary listener reading the text. It grounds the ancient history in the listener's present reality.
It takes the text out of the realm of myth and drops it squarely into the realm of lived history. The author is saying, I am not telling you a fairy tale. I'm explaining the architecture of your current world.
It reinforces a worldview of divine providence. Things do not happen by chance. Names are not arbitrary. Customs are not accidents. They are anchored in historical events where God acted.
The Äl-Kēn is the linguistic proof that history has a sovereign author. Every custom and every name is tied back to a specific moment of divine interaction with humanity.
We have synthesized an incredible scope of material today. We have seen that a single word, whether it is used to balance a poetic scale in Exodus, to declare divine judgment in the prophets, or to mark the origin of a city in Genesis, carries immense structural weight. It is not filler. It is the logic of the text itself.
And this raises a massive question for all of us to consider. We have spent this time looking strictly at the source material's outline of cause and effect, looking at these specific markers, Äl-Kēn and Lakin. They explicitly link human actions to historical and divine outcomes. If the ancient text is this precise about the logic of reality, how often do we fail to see the therefores operating in the logic of our own daily lives? We often live as if our actions are isolated events, disconnected from outcomes. But the text shows a universe where every action is weighed, every cause has an effect, and history is moving purposefully toward a conclusion under the sovereignty of God.
That is a staggering thought. Going back to our opening metaphor, you cannot look at the walls and the roof of your life and assume they are holding themselves up by magic. There is a blueprint. There is an architecture of cause and effect, of judgment and grace quietly holding it all together. Keep reading closely, keep looking for those structural hinges, and keep paying attention to the blueprints. Thanks for listening.